So a little while ago, I talked about Snow Crash, and there are some lingering questions left, so I guess we need to go deeper. But first, hello, my name is Garvin, and I read things and babble about them on the internet for your entertainment. This is the second video I've done on Neal Stephenson's novel Snow Crash. The first video is where I talk more generally about the novel and the characters, and it is linked in the description below. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the antagonist's Bob Riff's evil plan, and we're going to expand on that a bit. I'm not going to talk about Raven's evil plan because that plan is somewhat separate from Bob's, although it is running parallel to it. Today we're just going to talk about Bob. Well, without any further ado, let's turn to. So we're going to start with a character that doesn't get a lot of page time in the actual story, but his actions and his discoveries are the foundation of everything that happens in the novel. Dr. Emmanuel Lagos. He was a researcher that worked for the Library of Congress and then later the Central Intelligence Corporation. While working there, the doctor made a series of discoveries that he would bring to the attention of Bob, our primary villain, believing that Bob could use these discoveries to control his workforce and their access to information. Instead of paying the good doctor or hiring him, he instead threw Dr. Lagos out of his office, stole his idea, and then proceeded to work on it on his own. I gotta point out this was Bob's first and biggest mistake.
Let me explain.
You see, Bob did like Dr. Lagos' idea, and he did want to use it, but instead of pursuing the ability to mind control his workforce, Bob wanted to try something else, because he thought to himself as he looked at this idea, what if instead of controlling my workforce, I could control the entire human race? But that's not his mistake. His mistake is, instead of paying the good doctor or bringing him onto the team, he threw him out of his office, stole his idea, and ran with it on his own, which meant that Dr. Lagos, instead of working for Bob and helping foolproof his idea, turned to gathering enough information to explain and convince our heroes to stop Bob and giving them the means to do so. So, the very same action that starts the evil plot also starts the chain of events that leads to Bob's failure and downfall. Which is kind of an interesting note on how evil and greed are somewhat self-defeating. I mean, imagine if instead of throwing the doctor out, Bob had stood up and said, Emmanuel, can I call you Emmanuel? I gotta say, I really like your idea, but...
You mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
So at this point, you're probably asking, what were the discoveries that Dr. Lagos brought to Bob in the first place? To explain that, I'm going to have to go all the way back to ancient Sumeria, specifically the story of the Tower of Babel, which the version in the Old Testament is an explanation for why people speak different languages. In the novel, Dr. Lagos found what he believed was the truth behind the biblical story. And to really make this understandable, I have to start with a couple of real-world facts here. First, the Sumerian language is a language isolate. It is a language with no known relative languages. It's also, according to the sources I can find, the oldest known human language, dating to at least 3100 BC. And quite frankly, there is evidence that suggests it's actually quite a bit older. Again, both of these are true facts. In the story, Dr. Lagos' research suggests that Sumerian works on a deeper level than modern languages. It impacts the human brain right down to the brainstem. Just for the record, there is no evidence that that is true. This is just in the novel. However, in the novel, because of its impact on the human brain, the Sumerian language could be used to create what are called me's, behavioral algorithms that could program humans as if they were machines to perform certain actions or complete certain behaviors. These me's were controlled by priests who would actually use them to run the city-states of Sumeria. So humans at this point in history and human society in general were actually fairly different from modern humans in modern society, because instead of undergoing training and specialization, just to give an example, a priest would just download a me into a person and they would perform any role or task needed by the general society. However, there was a problem with this. In Sumeria, there was a cult devoted to a goddess named Ashera, and that cult was spreading a virus that was both biological and linguistic in nature. This virus made people more passive, more docile, generally more easily controllable and programmable. Perfect for someone like Bob, who's looking to exercise complete and total dominion over all language, communication, and, to be honest, over all people on the planet. In Sumeria, this virus was thwarted by a priest named Enki, who would later be promoted to a god in the Sumerian mythology. What he did was create a sort of antivirus, which, among other things, drives humans to create new languages and to fracture culturally, breaking us up into smaller units, which makes humans harder to control, but it also presents the spread of the virus. However, the Ashera cult remained active and was still able to spread the virus biologically by using various religious rituals and practices that I can't go too much into detail here without upsetting the Dreadlord algorithm, so I'm just going to tell you to read the book. In the novel, Hero, our main character, follows the trail of Dr. Lagos' research throughout the history of Mesopotamia and the Middle East, as the struggle to contain and prevent the spread of the virus can be seen in the much wider history, but one good example is specifically the history of Judaism in the creation of the Book of Deuteronomy and the rise of the Israeli monarchy, and how the people behind that were struggling to contain the spread of the virus through changing certain religious practices and reorganizing their society. It's kind of interesting, and it also involves the invasion of the Kingdom of Judea by Assyria, and
focus! Hey, come on! Focus!
Right, I'm wandering down a rabbit hole, sorry. So Bob has several problems. First, the counter-virus released by Enki is still running throughout the world's population, which makes them at least partially resistant to the Ashera virus. That's no good for Bob. So he needs to prep humanity and make them more vulnerable to the virus. This is something that's gonna take at least a decade of work on his part, but credit where credit is due, he's not only willing to put in the work, but he chooses to do this in an intelligent way, using multiple vectors of attack to spread out the impact and increase his chances of success. His first step is hijacking his own religion by, well, buying a Pentecostal church. Specifically, Reverend Wayne's Pearly Gates Church, which in the story is a very capitalist, ultra-right-wing American kind of church. Honestly, it's downright heretical. It elevates Elvis to a position in the Trinity. It's mentioned in the book that Reverend Wayne wrote a book called Elvis Shot Kennedy and Saved America from Communism, which I thought some of the stuff I heard my pastor saying growing up was weird. Bob used his resources to spread the church across the world and also spread the practice of speaking in tongues, or glossolalia, which is a religious practice. It's a form of religious euphoria that actually predates Christianity. It shows up in the Greek and Roman world, and it was linked to prophecy, and some of the later practitioners would claim that they were speaking angelic or celestial languages when they were speaking in tongues. It shows up during the Pentecostal revival in Los Angeles, and the Pentecostal church in America has its own very interesting history, which involves a lot of
Get on with it.
Right, Snow Crash, stick to the novel. I'm sorry guys, I will link some information on the Pentecostal church in the description below, but let's get back to the novel. Bob promotes speaking in tongues because that and the practices associated with it make the brain more vulnerable to the Ashera virus. Now, he's not going to just depend on that, so he's also going to use a strategy that all sorts of other imperialists throughout history have used over the centuries. He's going to use drugs. In this case, he creates a drug called Snow Crash that penetrates the cell walls of the brain to rewrite those cells and help spread the virus, making the brain more susceptible to it. He also creates a computer virus called Snow Crash that specifically targets the brains of hackers, computer programmers, and other information technology workers. And this virus leaves them basically brain fried. He specifically is targeting the information technology workers, computer programs, hackers, that kind of thing, because he doesn't want any of these people around unless they're under his direct control. So his religion spreads into the polite conservative elements of society, while his drugs spread into the more fringe and experimental parts of society. This is actually very clever, and I have to admit I'm somewhat impressed by this kind of evil planning, because he is making sure that the virus will be present in every social class and economic layer of society, preventing any large chunk of modern society from escaping his grip. That is impressive and thorough planning, even if it's completely evil. Now, we're not done yet, because Bob also introduces a third vector, a completely biological element to spreading the virus. You see, he bought the USS Enterprise, the aircraft carrier, when the US government basically collapsed due to hyperinflation. and he turned the Enterprise into the central linchpin of a floating megastructure called the Rife, which is basically created by hooking together a bunch of giant ships with the Enterprise at the center. The Rife travels with the currents of the Pacific Ocean, and when it reaches Asia, which is also suffering from hyperinflation and economic collapse in this story, it picks up legions of refugees, and when it floats back to North America, those refugees swarm ashore and disappear into the urban centers of what was once the United States. And Bob has infected the refugee population with the virus because the virus can also be passed on by
Fluid transfer?
Yeah, with that, I'm going to assume most of you can figure out why the Dreadlord algorithm would not want me talking too much about the practices of the Ashira cult, and we're just going to put a pin in it and move on. Getting back to Bob, by setting up society to be more susceptible to the virus while sending in thousands or even tens of thousands of people infected with the virus into American cities, he is making sure that it spreads rapidly, and spreads widely. He's also wired people up that he can transmit directly to and through to instruct people who are affected by the virus, because he has figured out a way to control them. Bob's plan is meant to come into fruition when he starts broadcasting these instructions to the infected and sees control of the North American continent to be his new base of operations, which will basically leave him as the God King of humanity. No, I'm not using the other term. He hasn't earned it. On a slightly more personal note, I did want to note I found it kind of ironic that the story does have an element of immigrants coming to America and spreading disease, but in this case, it's a disease created and purposely spread by an elite member of American society so that he can undercut what resistance is left to him and take direct control. Bob is already one of the wealthiest and most powerful men on the planet, but that's just not enough for him. He's angry that he can't directly wrench information out of people's brains and have more direct control over their actions and their lifestyles. And we've all known people like Bob, hopefully not as rich and powerful, at least not directly. For people like him, having anyone who can resist or escape their control is simply unacceptable, and they will keep trying to control and domineer everyone around them until they are stopped, one way or another. However, like many people, Bob is brought low by his greed and his need to control everything. And I don't just mean his first mistake of stealing Dr. Lagos' idea instead of just paying the man or even bringing him onto his crew. I mean things like his attacks on the hackers. When he spread the Snow Crash computer virus, he attracted attention. When he spread the Snow Crash drug, he attracted the attention of the mob, and this caused people to organize and to work against him. His actions convinced Hero and the other heroes to try and stop him. On top of that, his contempt for everybody who isn't like him meant that he didn't pay attention to any of these groups or individuals trying to stop him until it was too late and he was thwarted. It's always your own biases and your own flaws that trip you up in the end, right? It's on that note that I'm going to end this week's video. I hope you found it informative or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or subscribe, as that really helps me in my eternal battle with the Dreadlord algorithm. Terror be on his name. You can also support the fight by joining my Everwise patrons at the link below, where they vote on upcoming topics, like this one. Speaking of my Everwise patrons, special thank yous to Big Steve, Zengetorix, Krensbeth, and 125 quickfire questions of the Crane. Thanks guys, I really appreciate the support. Next week, I return to the Lensman universe with the novel Grey Lensman. I hope you join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading!